So there's a common misunderstanding amongst many Catholics, I mean, really people in general, in how to apply Matthew 16, verse 18 to the reality of the crisis that we are currently living through, the crisis facing the church, the modern day chastisement, the modern day apostasy. How do you apply Matthew 16:18, where our Lord tells St. Peter, on you I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it, right? The gates of hell will never prevail against my church. And when traditionalists such as myself talk about the crisis and things related to that, inevitably somebody comes out and says, no, you're wrong, because if it's true that, popes or a council could have said something erroneous or done something wrong or led people astray, then the gates of hell would have prevailed, and that would have contradicted our Lord in Matthew 16:18. So I just want to kind of clear this up with a very quick video. I've actually discussed this point in many videos and articles in the past, and various podcasts and articles I've written pertaining to the papacy or the crisis, but I just want to do a specific video addressing the point, for what it is. And it's a very simple point that I've always offered, and it's just the same point that I always reiterate when people make this comment. Matthew 16:18, when our Lord says, I will, you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, right? Will not prevail against her. What does our Lord mean? What does he intend to mean when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against it? What are the gates of hell, and how, what does it mean they're not going to prevail against his church? Well, the Vatican Council of 1870, dogmatic council, which gave us the dogmatic teachings pertaining to the papacy, and the perpetuity, the visibility of the papacy, the dogma of papal infallibility, and the limits behind that dogma and what it means and how it applies and when it doesn't apply. And the very council that gave us all this gave us the infallible understanding of Matthew 16, verse 18. And it's the church's prerogative to give that understanding, right? It's the prerogative of the magisterium, especially when she exercises infallibility, to tell us what does a passage mean. And Vatican Council of 1870 told us what Matthew 16:18 means, specifically the gates of hell. And there are two things that the church talks about in Pastor Aeternus, the document from the Vatican Council. Two things that apply to Matthew 16:18. And so here we're getting to what our Lord intended by saying the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Number one, the Vatican Council talked to us about the perpetuity of the office of the papacy, and applied this to Matthew 16:18, and said, and the saying that St. Peter will have successors until the end of time, or until the end of the world. All right, and the papacy, really is, you could see, a matter of divine providence, its institution, because that succession has gone through every century since, right, to the present day. And you're not going to find any other system of government, that has had succession going back 2,000 years, in an unbroken line of succession, the way you're going to find with the Catholic Church. Now, that doesn't mean there haven't been periods of upheaval, periods of interregnums, sometimes a little bit extended here and there, due to any number of factors or reasons or issues. Of course, it's a given that when a pope dies, there's little breaks in between, or there's periods of confusion where you have one person who's a pope, another person professing also to be a pope, and one of those is an anti-pope. So you have all those things in between, the timeline, the time scale. But from the wide perspective as a whole, from St. Peter to present day, you have this unbroken line of succession. The office of the papacy continues to exist, right? And that truly, after 2,000 years and everything that the church has been through, from periods of crisis to, times of very scandalous and immoral leaders, to times of grave persecution, to, everything you can imagine, crusades, everything, that office still exists today. It still exists today. St. Peter still has his successors to this day, all right? And that was the first thing that the Vatican Council told us about. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. meaning that our Lord intended to teach that St. Peter will have successors until the end of time, or until the end of the world. All right, so we still have that. Number two, the second thing the Vatican Council taught us is that St. Peter and his successors, okay, so the popes, the successors of St. Peter, the popes, will never bind the universal church infallibly to a lie or a falsehood or a heresy. And this is because Matthew 16:18 connects to the very next verse, in which our Lord says the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And he tells St. Peter, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And in that passage, those are Greek singulars. Our Lord's talking to St. Peter, and by extension, his successors. Okay, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. All right. And what's one thing we know about this passage? Well, who is in heaven? God is in heaven. And Titus 1 verse 2 tells us that God cannot bind a lie. So that means whatever St. Peter, and by extension his successors, bind must be true, because it's bound in heaven, and God cannot bind a lie. So this is applying to infallible, authoritative teachings of the popes. Okay, not everything that a pope says in private, not what he says in the speech, not what he says to a newspaper reporter, not even in pastoral documents. It's talking very specifically about infallible proclamations, infallible teachings, dogmatic definitions, okay, authoritative and infallible. When St. Peter and his successors bind the universal church infallibly to a doctrine pertaining to faith or morals, it will be a true binding. It will be a true teaching, because St. Peter and his successors cannot bind a lie, a falsehood, or a heresy. That's what our Lord intended to mean again with Matthew 16:18, when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, meaning Peter will have successors till the end of the world, and those successors will have the ability to infallibly bind the church if they so choose, and when they choose to do that, it will not be a lie, a falsehood, or a heresy. All right, so both of those two statements from the traditionalist perspective still apply to this very day. Okay, even in our criticisms of Vatican II, or the pontiffs during and since Vatican II, okay, none of them have infallibly, authoritatively bound us to a lie, a falsehood, or a heresy. All right, so those two statements still apply, and thus Matthew 16:18 still holds true even in the present day, even through the traditionalist perspective. The gates of hell have not prevailed against the church. So again, it's a common misunderstanding, because people want to, interpret what they think gates of hell will not prevail means. But that's the understanding that comes to us from the infallible and authoritative Vatican Council of 1870 in its teaching on Matthew 16:18. All right. The other thing, of course, that we know for sure is that St. Paul told us that prior to the coming of the Antichrist, there would be an apostasy. And Our Lady of Fatima taught us in 1917, in the third part of The Secret, that the apostasy would come from the very top. And like I always say, apostasies come from the true from the true religion. All right, so the word apostasy literally means defecting from the truth, defecting from the true religion. That's an apostasy. So the crisis we're living in vindicates the truth of the Catholic religion. All right, just want to make sure I, again, clarify that. So, again, and to summarize, when traditionalists offer criticisms to whatever degree, okay, or challenge the narrative as when it comes to the Second Vatican Council, or when it comes to the men reigning in Rome during and since the Second Vatican Council, that is not a contradiction of Matthew 16:18 if we understand Matthew 16:18 as it's taught to us by the magisterium of the Vatican Council of 1870, which gave us two things that passage is teaching. And those two things, even under the traditionalist perspective, still apply to this very day. So I hope that makes sense. God bless you.